Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Craig McInnes. I'm the co-CEO and co-founder at My Caribou, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. Very excited to have a great group of panelists again this time. A little background on us. My Caribou is a partner management platform that's built specifically for Medtech and helps manufacturers and distributors accelerate growth in markets around the world. So the key aspects of the platform are the ability to match and connect with over 20,000 distributors and or 20,000 manufacturers in over 125 countries, to navigate global data from over 100 countries, so there's 80,000 data points in markets around the world, to collaborate with your existing and new partners in secure workspaces. So think in terms of things like sales forecasts, file sharing, discussions between partners, quarterly business reviews, and so on. And then finally, to monitor and measure your partner and market performance globally. You do have access to sign up for this for free, excuse me. And I believe Angela is going to post a link to the sign up in the chat panel as we go along today. I will do a brief demo at the end of today's session, but obviously give everyone the opportunity to drop off if you're already a user, already using the platform, or don't have time to stay for the demo afterwards. But I'll do a quick kind of 10-minute demo at the end of the panel today. So just to kind of bring everybody up to speed, this is the third in a three-part series of discussions around partnering. I have a slight echo on the line. Maybe just we'll just have everyone mute momentarily while there we go. So in previous panels discussions, we focused on finding, vetting, and selecting great partners. And Angela's going to post a link to the recordings from these previous sessions. There's actually a couple different sessions that we recorded around that. So for this discussion today, we're going to assume that we have the right partner. So we've already done the work of finding, vetting, and finding a great or signing a great partner. And we're going to discuss how we can establish reasonable sales expectations and execute sales and marketing projects together to create stronger, more successful partnerships for new and existing relationships. In terms of background, so I always like to share this. We have, I believe, almost 400 signups for the panel today from around the globe, representing over 50 countries on 6 continents. The breakdown is roughly, this changes slightly between webinars, although it's pretty consistent actually overall. But 55% of the attendees today are manufacturers, 30% are distributors, dealers, sales agents, and then 15% are others, so market consultants, regulatory consultants, trade organizations, and so on. So I'm looking forward to some great questions from the group as we go through this. Let me introduce you to today's panelists. So first, Vince Morelli has over 30 years of executive level experience in Medtech with Baxter, Cardinal Health, and Invacare. Most recently, Vince served as Director of Business Development with Canadian Hospital Specialties, which is a leading manufacturer and specialty distributor in Canada. Vince has successfully launched products, built and managed manufacturer distributor relationships, and established GPO and shared service organization collaborations. Next, we have Mark Rathbone, who has over 38 years in the med tech industry, working for companies like J&J, Baxter, and Medtronic. During that time, Mark has held local, country, and European leadership positions in sales and marketing. And over the last 7 years, Mark has been a senior director, developing and managing the EMEA indirect markets for Cardinal Health. And then finally, Alana Rogers has more than 15 years of experience in sales and global business expansion, with a career spanning various industries and countries. With manufacturer Eakin Surgical, where she is currently, Alana is responsible for growing and managing global sales channels alongside maintaining and developing mutually beneficial relationships with their distributor network. Alana has an excellent track record identifying and opening new international sales channels, navigating the strict medical device regulatory landscape, manufacturer distributor relationships, and management of a global sales team. I will provide contact information at the end of the session for all 3 panelists as well as myself. I'll thank them in advance for sharing that. I know many relationships form out of these panels. When I talk to panelists afterwards, they often have new connections with manufacturers and distributors around the globe as a result of this. So certainly feel free to reach out to them if you've got an opportunity to work together. Now, in terms of administratively here, we're going to have questions come in through the Q&A panel. You could also use the chat panel if you prefer, but the Q&A panel is preferred. But whatever works on your end, we'll try to get to all those questions by the end of the session. So Vince, Mark, Alana, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate you donating your time to this session. And let's get started. The first topic we're gonna touch on is establishing sales expectations, and we'll start with our first question here, which is, how do you establish sales targets when manufacturer expectations are high and distributors fear overcommitting and underperforming? And I think, Mark, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Vince.
Sorry, I'm on mute there. Thank you very much, Craig. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on which part of the world you're in. This is a great question. And I think probably the root of it has probably been covered in previous presentations, in that establishing a relationship with the right business partner, distributor or manufacturer is the underpinning of pretty much everything that we're going to talk about today, I believe. And it's certainly the case in this question as well. I think it's important that companies see distributors not just as box movers or somebody that works for them, rather as a business partner that you work with for the benefit of both companies and the expansion of both businesses. So with that said, there are a number of probably 3 or 4 key criteria that I'd look for in growing the business. First one is understanding the contract environment of the country you're operating in. A good example of that could be Saudi Arabia, where we're working at the moment, and they have a new contract position, a new contract status with the national government distributor, NUPCO, N-U-P-C-O, and understanding where your product is on the timescale of that NUPCO contract, which is usually a 3-year contract, will clearly have an impact on how you sell and how much you can sell of your product. And certainly will define what kind of work you need to do to get it on contract, not there previously. Then you have the kind of more normal criteria to look at. So price positioning, are you seen as a higher end product with more USPs, or are you more a commodity-led product? Either one is fine, but you need to bear that in mind as well, considering the state of the market, if it's private or public, and which areas you want to position it in. Then look at the competitor profile. Some of the competitors in these countries may have a direct operation and have a larger sales force than you may have with a distributor, and clearly that's going to impact how much market share you believe you can take and how long you can do that. Then you need to look at, from a distributor point of view, how many sales force, what resources, what human resources are they going to put into the market for your product? And clearly, the more you can put into that, more resources you can put into the market, the better chance of getting quicker share you're going to get. And then finally, it's what resources you as a company, if you're a manufacturer, want to invest into that market. It's the same advantage. The more you invest, the more return you'll get. But likewise, you need to balance your investment with what return you think you're going to get. So it is a careful to and fro looking at all the criteria. But I think underpinning all this, it's all about mutual trust. You, your business partner, and ensuring that together you're going to be moving forward, not one versus another, or independently trying to do something without the other one. So I think that will probably summarize my thoughts on that.
Vince, CHS is both a manufacturer and a distributor, a national distributor in Canada. So you've actually experienced both sides of the coin, even in your current role. And I think what Mark mentioned about the Saudi Arabian market also applies to the Canadian market, which is very tender or bid based as well. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and Mark obviously did a great job of kind of laying out the criteria here. But what I might add, and by the way, good day everyone, and thanks for joining us. It really does depend on a number of things in terms of how easy it's going to be to establish those targets and forecasts. Is it a product which is a relatively new technology that you're introducing, or are you effectively introducing a product which is also already well accepted and being used, albeit from another manufacturer? So those types of things will come into play. The distributor should have a very good understanding of the market opportunity, the size of the pie, so to speak, and who the competitors are in those spaces, and what their relative market shares are. In the Canadian market, data is not that easy to come by. So you often have to sort of build it from the ground up, so to speak, based on what you know and what other businesses you're involved with, which are tangential to what you're talking about. But obviously, the dialogue between a manufacturer and a distributor, very open and honest conversation about, hey, what can we honestly expect to achieve in the first year, and then build from there. Often the first year forecast is the most challenging because you're really starting with very little information.
Right. And Alana, with Ecid Surgical, obviously, manufacturer that has existing partners, but also growing, adding new partners, establishing the sales expectations with those partners. What are your thoughts on the topic?
I would have to agree with both Mark and Vince. They've covered some very good points there, and this is kind of the way that I would work in the markets also. For existing distributors that we have, we do look at their historical sales figures, for example, to make sure that they have a growth pattern in place and that it is both organic and kind of a moving forward growth pattern also. But for anybody new, I would kind of look at, well, I suppose the pandemic has thrown this up. I look at their current status within the country, or the current status of the country, in that is there anything that is going to be affecting sales, or anything that is going to effectively close channels for us to work through. And I find this to be quite important. I'm completely realistic with the company as to what I think, as in the company I work for, as to what I think a partner should be able to do and what they can expect to achieve. Even if my expectations would differ somewhat from the company's, I do like to be upfront about what a partner should be able to do for us. And then, as I think it was Vince maybe that said, open discussions, and Mark had also said mutual trust. This is key for me, because I think that realistically, I work on a target that I think the country should achieve based on market research and information. I also ask the potential distributor for their own, and then hopefully we're kind of working in the same pattern. And if not, then it opens up discussions about why it's so different or what we each think the other should be doing. So yeah, just kind of a backup to what the two guys have said. They're completely on the right path.
Okay, excellent. So the second question is around the gotchas, I guess, for lack of a better term. So again, why don't we start with Vince on this one? But Vince, with CHS, you represent, in addition to being a manufacturer, you represent a lot of global brands in Canada. What are some of the gotchas that a distributor should avoid when agreeing to sales targets and inventory purchases?
Well, I'll kind of touch again on, you really need to know the opportunity and where are the GPO contracts in the cycle, because as you mentioned earlier, Mark, Craig, our environment here in Canada is highly tendered. So, if you are at the beginning of a contract cycle, it may be several years before you actually have an opportunity to present the particular products that you're working with to the GPO community and get on a contract. So many times the initial phases of that product launch is more about getting the product recognized in the market, having evaluations done in the market, so that when the time comes for bidding on contracts, you've actually had people that have tried the product and had satisfactory experiences with it. So those are going to be important. But in terms of gotchas, take or pay contracts are very difficult, and we tend to shy away from those. So not having a fixed dollar amount that you must purchase, it's a target, and it's a mutually agreed upon target. And the key there is having an open dialogue on a consistent basis. So you're not waiting until the end of the first year to have a discussion about how we're doing. Part of what we find works well for us are very regular communications, very regular meetings. At the beginning of the relationship, it might be monthly, and then it transitions into a quarterly business review. At those reviews is when you're having that conversation about how are we doing to the target. What's the pipeline look like? When are the opportunities expected to close? Those are some of the things that we would openly share with our partner, to let them know where we're working, how many opportunities are in the pipeline, what the prospects for closing, and when.
And Alana, with Eakin, you know, on the other side of the coin on this, you need to be able to forecast globally. You need to be able to manage supplies and inventory. Working with distributors like Vince around the world. What are your thoughts on it?
The way that I would approach this is realistically, I'm a bridge, I suppose, between the commercial function of a business and the operational function of a business. So in order for each of us to be able to fulfill our own expectations for the business, I need to be funneling back the correct information. So this is again a clear and open discussion with your distributor. If I'm taking on a new distributor, for example, I would want to train them, want to make them understand the product that we have. So therefore, they're not just agreeing in principle to a large inventory stock to take on board without understanding, you know, where they're going to sell it. I would want them to supply me with a business plan and a sales timeline. If they're going to take in X amount of stock, when do they expect to sell it? Is it something that's going to sit around for a year before they have finished with registrations, for example? There's a lot of little bit parts you need to take into consideration for new sales channels. So what I would want them to do is work with me and discuss what they think that their market should be doing, what they think realistically they should be bringing in inventory wise. And even if it's not that much in the first year, I think it's really important to understand that. And I think, again, if you can understand that with your distributor, you open up a really good form of communication as well, because they are a business and you're not expecting them to just take a pile of stock and then don't deal with it afterwards. You know, I want to open up a long-standing relationship. So it is kind of getting that open forum, that open discussion at the beginning, and just saying you don't have to do X amount in the first year. You just need to do this amount that is realistic, and then we build on it from the first year afterwards.
Perfect. And Mark, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, there was some great points made there. I mean, I could perhaps share as a manufacturer the questions and concerns that our distributors of our stuff. Firstly, the first one, and I think is relevant to all of us in this day and age, is supply status. We know with COVID and transportation issues that it's important that whatever target or expectations that are set reflect some of the challenges in transportation. I think also shelf life of products. I think Alana mentioned there about inventory. You've got to be very careful managing inventory with a smaller shelf life, but clearly it will go out of date. You're going to assume that all of the products are registered and are legal to sell in the country. And I think the last thing I'd perhaps mention is whether the contract you have with the manufacturer is exclusive or non-exclusive, because clearly that would impact what you can sell and what other competitors might be selling against you. So those are all other factors I would just add into the mix for thought and consideration.
Perfect. So let's go to question 3 here. And the question is, how often should sales targets be reviewed, and what methods do you use to measure and revise those targets? And let's start with Alana on this one.
Okay, so I approach this in 2 ways. So I do a personal review of the targets and what the distributors are bringing in every month. I don't necessarily relay this back to the distributor unless they're new. So if you look at it from the point of view of an existing distributor, I would do a review with them every quarter. But with a new distributor, whilst they're starting out, it would be every month or every 6 weeks or so, just to make sure that they're on track and if they have questions, if they need to know anything. How I would look at these then is I look at the sales that we have, the actual sales versus the forecasted sales, and then I put that all against budget. So this does sound like it's all the one thing, but it's not. It's 3 very different prongs to a fork, because sometimes what you forecast to come in doesn't necessarily align with the budget, because there's obviously a little scope for movement in budget. Then I look at any anomalies. Are there new products that they've started taking on? If so, why? Is there a decline in a product that they've always bought? If so, why? And it opens up another form of communication between you and the distributor. Then I would look at the forthcoming quarter to see if we have any forward orders placed for that, because if we're slightly behind in, say, Q1, we would want to be looking to be slightly ahead in Q2 or Q3 to make sure that overall we're bringing in the correct budget for the year. And then sometimes, and it has been sort of more through COVID, I've noticed this, but it's turned out to be quite a handy tool, is that I would reflow the budget if needed. Now, I have to say boards don't always necessarily like this, But I think it's much better to be transparent to say we thought we were going to do this in Q1, but I think realistically by the time registrations are finished, we should reflow that out to Q3. Overall, you're getting the same figure, but it just eases the pressure a little bit on both our business and the business of the partner in country.
Perfect. Mark, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I again, fully aligned with what Alana was saying. We tend to review our business with each distributor who we've been working with for a number of years, so they're not new. We would do it every quarter. We'd obviously look at revenue as the key component or key KPI. We'd also look at percent margin, because one of the things I think is important is that clearly we have an annual price list for our distributor. But if they say, look, guys, we've got this huge opportunity coming, it's a big national tender, it's multi-million-dollar. If we can just fine tune some of the pricing by a couple of points, we can be very, I think that's worthy of dialogue. So analyzing percent margin is important. But for us, what's also important is the forecast they give us for units of products. They are buying those units. The worst thing in the world is they promise a huge order that never comes, because you then get left with dated inventory, or vice versa. So unit forecasts are also very important as well.
I would have to just jump in and say I completely agree with this and what you're saying about tenders, and how this can affect the margin of the product, because I think when you're working with distributors, it's great to look at the bigger picture, in that you may take a hit of maybe 5% in your overall gross margin, but you've also won a tender and you're going to be established in that country for 3 years, for example, and you've opened up a different sales channel. So again, we do tend to look at, the nitty gritty, the granular, small figures, things like that. But if you can step back and work with your distributor and look at an overall picture and see what you're going to gain sort of long term out of working with them, then I think that can also be a really viable thing to do.
Vince, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, great comments from both the panelists so far. But I think the other thing is, and I think we're going to talk a little bit about this up in the next question, is how do you marry the marketing activity, sales and marketing activity that you're agreeing to as part of your annual plan, to the forecasts and targets, right? Because maybe you're planning promotion, maybe you're planning webinars for customers, and you want to kind of make sure that the forecasts that you're looking at kind of aligns to what you're planning to do in the upcoming quarter, as part of the communication, kind of that regular back and forth that happens between the two partners.
Perfect. We touched on KPIs last webinar, but also did a podcast on it. And KPIs, I know Mark mentioned it, but as a really a leading indicator, and sales being a trailing indicator. So maybe Ange, if you get a second to post that into the chat, it would be good for people to have access to that podcast. We spent about 20 minutes on KPIs and drilling into that and using that as a tool to help drive future sales, obviously. Okay, so let's hit the fourth question here in this topic, and then we'll move on to the second topic. And I think, Mark, we'll start with you on this one. So do your current partnerships involve penalties and or incentives for missing or exceeding sales targets?
This is a great question, and quite a controversial one as well sometimes. Let's start with incentives. Truthfully, I try very hard not to give incentives, not because I'm naturally tight or anything like that. It's simply because my view is, if you give incentives, you tend to, you'll certainly reduce your margins. Now, that said, if you gave incentives to increase an order, you get economies of scale a little bit, but really reducing the margins directly drops straight through to the bottom line. I think is a dangerous thing to get to, a dangerous road to go down. I think also it tends to devalue the product in the mind of the business partner. If you're willing to cut price just to get a big deal at the end of the quarter, or just hike sales up, it kind of devalues the work you've been doing previously. And I think also the smart distributors will know when your quarter end comes, so they'll avoid ordering until that quarter end comes, and then suddenly you're going to be getting all kind of requests for discount and bulk orders, all that stuff. So I tend not to do it. I'm not saying I've never done it. I think there are the odd occasion when if it suits both the business partner and the company, then fair enough, but otherwise not. Regarding penalties, we don't. I don't think I've ever penalized a distributor, primarily because if you've got the right relationship with your distributor, you go through all of the criteria that we've spoken about today, you very rarely get to the end of the year with a nasty surprise, and you can kind of fix that as the year goes on. So I can't say I've ever been in a position where we've had to penalize somebody, and certainly going through the last 2 years with COVID, where elective surgeries have been cut and reduced or almost eliminated. It's not the distributor's fault they can't sell a certain product because there's no market there any longer. So it comes back to the right at the start of the conversation about mutual trust and strong relationships and working together with a business partner rather than an adversarial kind of way.
And Vince, again, you're on both sides of the coin here as a manufacturer and distributor. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, as far as incentives, I would echo, what Mark had to say. We prefer to just talk about, the best price, the best everyday price, rather than talking about incentives later on, if this, then that. It also makes it more complicated to just administer the relationship. And so our preference is just to, talk about a good everyday price and value from that perspective. As far as penalties go, early on, obviously, there's a lot of discussion, right? If you're talking about the first year, you're generally going to kind of adjust as you go, as Mark said. But ultimately, in most of our agreements, we would have exit clauses, or if it's an exclusive agreement and we're not hitting our targets, there's an option to turn the agreement into a non-exclusive agreement, or eventually terminate the agreement if things aren't working for the two parties. So that's really where I wouldn't necessarily call them penalties. They're just contractual terms that allow for for an adjustment of the strategy in the country, should things not be working.
If I could just maybe add a point to that, it's a critical point that Vince made there. We mentioned the world we're in with COVID. I've seen some companies demand a price increase under the auspice of a contract of force majeure with COVID and transportation and raw material costs. I think that's a dangerous road to go down at the moment, because the world's in a very unstable place in many ways, but we're all suffering it together. I think a more mutually discussed and planned increase over an iterative period of years is better than this kind of force majeure that some companies have used in contracts, and it's something that I would advise against. You might get some short-term benefit, but long-term, I think, really disadvantages stuff. Sorry to butt in, but that's very
great. Yeah, perfect. And Alana?
No, I would have to completely agree with both Vince and Mark. I would have to say I don't tend to penalise distributors. If the relationship isn't working, then it's not working. And I don't tend to work through a series of penalties, because it just sours the relationship and it just drags out what is inevitably going to be a termination of the contract. So that's why the consistent communication and reviews are so vitally important with the distributors, because it means that you do actually avoid reaching that point. And if you are at that point, it means realistically both of you have agreed to step away from the agreement, and you can therefore go and look for another distributor within that market. Incentives, I don't really tend to do either, because I think that it does devalue the product, but also when you're looking for a long-term relationship, how do you keep incentivizing that relationship? How do you bring it anew each year? If their company is evolving and yours is evolving, how do you keep looking for new incentives? Having said that, we do have a Best Performing Distributor Award that was a concept recently devised by our marketing department, and it's really just to show our thanks. It's a little plaque trophy that we would give to 4 of the best performing distributors, and that's not on being the largest distributor, things like that. It's how they've grown their business, their growth year on year, if they brought on new lines. It's more a reflection of the relationship that we have with the distributor, as opposed to saying, you've been a really big distributor for us, here's a prize. So again, I think if you have to look at both penalties and incentives, you're maybe not in the right relationship with the right distributor at that point, because you're probably looking for two different end games.
Perfect. So just as we wrap up this topic, before we move into the execution of sales and marketing projects with partners, I think Angela has a poll she's going to bring up on this first topic. So we can go ahead and do that poll if it's ready. There it goes. So how often do you review, sales targets with your partners? Weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, quarterly? Looking for it on average. Obviously, it's going to be different for different relationships, but in general, how often do you review your sales targets with your partners? Okay, let that go for a second or two here. And Angela, if you want to bring it up, the results, there we go. So significantly on quarterly, pretty good chunk of monthly, roughly a third of you said monthly, and then a handful sort of in the weekly, bi-weekly buckets. So probably about what I would have expected, but it's always interesting to see the results. Okay, so let's move on to the second topic, which is really about collaboration between partners on executing sales and marketing projects. So this one, I'm going to start with Vince, but I'll just tee it up with the fact that in previous webinars, we've talked about how important, a collaborative relationship is between partners, between manufacturers and distributors. So if you could talk a little bit about how important it is to share the execution of projects between partners, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is really important. And for us, in my experience, it starts with the development of the local strategy, the in-country strategy. And, what I always say is we're going to adapt, or we're going to adopt and adapt the manufacturer's strategy for the local market. So having a great understanding of what the manufacturer is trying to achieve from a global marketing strategy perspective, and then we take that and adapt it to the local conditions, and that becomes the basis of what we're going to refer back to during our quarterly business reviews. Okay, we said this was the strategy. We said these are the tactics and the activities that we're going to undertake in order to achieve the strategy. How are we doing? Do we need to make a mid-year adjustment to the strategy because it's not working? Do we need to do more of something? Right? In our experience, again, there's a multitude of ways to make sure that you guys are aligned. You're aligned with between the distributor and the manufacturer. Sorry, a bit of a echo there. So, some of the things that we would do is encourage co-travel and have representatives from the manufacturer come up into Canada and spend some time in the field, going to see customers, making sure that's happening, doing webinars for customers, and in order to maybe get at a pain point and learn a little bit more about what customers are feeling from the product's perspective. That's important, and those all just help kind of make sure that the manufacturer also can see that we're working, as we're representing them, right? And that's the key to it. They just want to see that you're putting the effort in that you said you would put in. And that's part of the developing that relationship and that trusting relationship.
Yeah, we'll dig into a bit further on that in the next question as well. Alana, with Eakin Surgical, obviously, you've got partnerships in place. Some are newer, some are longer term relationships. How do you collaborate with your partners to try to drive sales with them in their markets?
I think the first and most vital piece of information I would give is that you need to remember the distributor is a business in its own right. And I've worked in places where people see distributors as an extension of their own sales team, and that I think is the wrong way to approach it, because realistically this is a person that knows the market so much better than you, and you're going to serve two purposes when you work with them. because they're going to be your eyes and ears in the market, and they're going to sell your product in the market, and probably much better than you could have when you don't have a direct sales team, if you were just trying to sell direct to market yourself. So how I look at it is it is a collaboration between two companies, and there's a kind of mutual business growth and mutual understanding of where you both want to be in year one, year two, and so on and so forth. So we offer like market visits, which I think Vincent said it's really important. For a new distributor, for example, I would go out and train the distributor in market with their sales team, with their marketing team, things like that. And I would take all of our marketing tools, materials, sales tools, sales presentations, anything that realistically can help them. And so what I like to feel at the end of a training session is that they can sell, the salespeople in the distributors company could sell our product as well as our own sales team could. And then time permitting, you would normally add on a customer visit with that to show to the customers and end users that there's a collaboration between the distributor and the supplier, and they can see that we're very invested in this person, and it's not just a sale with no after sale. We're invested in this company, we're invested in this market, and that we have a very good working relationship. And then also alongside that, I would work on their projects with them, and the likes of tenders. You know, I think we mentioned earlier, if you have to give a little bit of a discount on prices for tenders, again, it shows that you are willing to work with that partner in the market. But then on top of that, if they have projects or if they have something that they want to execute themselves, they have an idea of something that works very well in their market. You know, for example, we do things called a lunch and learn, where you would set up in a room in a hospital, and the nurses and surgeons and stuff would come in and view the product, and we would do a presentation on the product and have a Q&A after it. We bring in some lunch because everybody likes a little bit of food, and we find that that really works well in some markets, and then other markets have their own ideas. So realistically, it does boil down to understanding that you're working with a company who's very eager to sell your product, and you both put your own collaborations forward and move on from there.
That's great. Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think the guys have exhausted the cupboard of ideas, really. There's not much I can add. Yeah, the only two things I would perhaps add is I think if you're co-visiting, something touching on what Alana said, if you're co-visiting with a distributor, it shows a couple of things. One is, as Alana said, that you work together collaboratively and you respect the business partner you've chosen in that country. But likewise, you respect the clinical, the healthcare professional, because you travel to meet with them and get their thoughts and their insight. That kind of bigs them up a little bit too. And certainly for the key hospitals and the key clinicians in whichever country, it's always a good idea to get some kind of personal relationship with those guys going as well. The only other thing we would add is, as a manufacturer, if we were at a major exhibition, we would invite our distributors to use our booths as an area to meet customers, or hang out with some of the product managers or the finance guys, whatever it might be, to learn more about the company, the products, and how we can help, and use that as an area so we can interact collaboratively as well. So that's the only 2 points.
But great point, Mark. As a matter of fact, that I spent Saturday at a medical device reprocessing conference locally here, and we had a couple of our manufacturing partners visit with us and actually work the booth side by side with our team. That's a great way to see a number of customers in a day or 2 days.
I've done that before and it's worked really well. I've had some smaller distributors, which would be family-run companies, and we've supported them at their own in-country exhibitions, and for some of them I've attended the exhibition and worked the stand for them so they can concentrate on having meetings with their own potential clients and things like that. I'll do the meet and greet at the booths and things, and it really does foster such a good relationship with the distributor as well, because you've shown that you both believe in their company and you're willing to put the work in to help them grow.
And I think we've all missed that personal communication over the last couple of years that we had become accustomed to, of having face-to-face meetings with your partners. It's nice to be able to have them come and visit us again and spend some time, strategizing, just reviewing things. It's just different than doing it over Zoom.
I agree.
So it's a perfect segue into the second question. You've all talked about suppliers and distributors working together, interacting with distributor customers. Is it a red flag if distributors are not willing to have suppliers interact with their customers? And Alana, let's start with you from a manufacturer perspective. What are your thoughts here?
I would have to say it would be a serious red flag for me, almost a deal breaker in some situations. I have worked previously with distributors that have resisted all attempts to visit market. They won't give forecasts. They don't give information about the market. They don't want you to know who their end users are or anything like that. And a couple of times it has turned out it's because they're trying to keep your product out of market. So they know another company that is selling a kind of similar or Me Too product, and they've agreed with that company that they can corner that side of the market and they'll keep somebody else's product out. And it's really frustrating because you've spent a lot of time and effort finding that distributor, meeting with them, going to train them. You've invested a lot of money from the company perspective and it comes to nothing. So for me, if they don't want to have you interact with their customers, if they don't want to have you visit, then it's something that really needs to be drilled down into because there's something bigger at play there. And for me personally, it would lead to me terminating the contract and moving on to someone else.
Just as I'm going to ask Mark to chime in on this, I know some chats, there's people chatting a little bit on this topic. Feel free to do that. That's great. There's a few comments around some of the things we just talked about. That's awesome. If you have questions, I'll just reiterate, throw those in the Q&A panel if you can, please, and we'll get to those towards the end. So Mark, what are your thoughts on this one? Again, you're sort of on both sides of the coin here too, right? So.
Well, no, I'm just from a manufacturing point of view, but the quick answer is yes. Of course, it's a massive red flag for all the reasons Alana mentioned. If you haven't got that mutual trust and respect, and they don't believe you can add value to their business, then either you're doing something very wrong or they are. Either way, it's not a marriage made in heaven, and I think it would be something to avoid very quickly.
And Vince?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's really part of our pitch when we're talking to potential new partners. Really is the open collaboration and the open discussion that we expect of that relationship, right? So, and that's everything from helping to train our sales team, working in the field, answering our questions that come back from the customers, and just not hiding anything from each other, because really it doesn't do any benefit to the relationship. And I've been part of the situations where manufacturers have made changes in their distribution in country simply because they weren't getting that kind of contact and information sharing, and that was something they desired, and they found it with us. So I think it can actually hurt a distributor to be too closed when it comes to sharing information.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the fear on the case of some of the distributors is that the manufacturer ends up going direct in the market with those relationships. And I know in a previous session we had a great distributor, actually in Canada as well, mention that the reality is if you're doing an amazing job selling the product in that country, you're bringing so much value that shouldn't really be a risk. I think Vince, you and I have talked about that previously as well. That's the way CHS feels about it, I believe, too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's it's also like the life of a distributor that those types of decisions get made sometimes, and it likely had nothing to do with your performance. It was other business decisions, acquisitions, changes in strategy, or maybe you were so successful that the business got to the size that it made more sense for them financially to have their own people in place. Right. That comes with the territory of being a distributor.
And it's also a little naive in the sense that you can go to the country and speak to healthcare professionals and buying groups and government agencies without the permission of the distributor. So they're not going to stop, because Vince's point is absolutely right. Ultimately, many distributors make the business so successful, the company decides to go direct. Well, that's the circle of life a little bit there, isn't it? But you can't, just by avoiding a relationship with the company and the customer, that's not going to prevent that happening. Those guys will still talk to the customers, so you're not gaining that.
Perfect. So let's just segue into a little bit more of a anecdotal question here. So I'm hoping you'll share some examples. So the question here is, can you share an example where collaboration on a business development project really paid off? So we're looking for some anecdotes here, and well, let me start with Mark in this case.
Yeah, in fact, we just completed one which is very successful, and this is what we call the hub and spoke model. I'm sure many people will have heard that elsewhere as well. When you're looking for efficiencies of cost, of supply, of management, to supply product into one main country, and then that distributor then supplies it on into so-called smaller countries, rather than you having to supply all of them together, it is a really good model for a manufacturer, and I'm sure in some cases for the distributors too, because they benefit from having your business in the smaller hubs. So for example, we're doing this now in Poland. We're using Poland as the hub with a company there, and that company also represents us in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And they're doing a great job. So we just supply straight to Poland as you would normally. The guys then have businesses in those three Baltic state countries, and they represent us there. And it's a really good. It's good for them because they have spread of our product across 4 countries. It's good for us because we ship to one point, so there are efficiencies of transportation there, and we're growing the business together. The one caveat to that would be that certainly for my company, compliance is top of the list for everything. And we get very nervous when companies use sub-distributors because they've not been vetted through our compliance and legal teams and understand what our standards are. So I would just say that it's important, if you're doing that, it's the company you have the relationship with in the hub are the ones that are also representing you in the spoke countries as well, rather than using sub-distributors. It's proven to be very successful. It's brought us together, relationships strengthened. We've both got benefits out of it. And it's certainly something we're looking to do in other parts of the world as well, particularly in the kind of world we're in right now.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of our customers speak to that in terms of Latin America as well, using that model, Southeast Asia, certainly Eastern Europe, you know, Gulf states and so on. So yeah, we're actually going to do a webinar series coming up on some market strategies, go-to-market strategies in different parts of the world. So it'll be interesting to hear what our panelists will say there. Vince, do you want to chime in on this one?
Sure. Great points by Mark, by the way. I think, we're a little bit more kind of concentrated in terms of our activity, mostly Canada, a little bit. We do, because of our manufacturing operations, we do have some business in the United States as well. And so, but we pretty much limit our activity to North America. In terms of things that have worked well, I mean, the extreme example that I like to tell about us is that this was a number of years ago where a product was actually in development, and it's for use in the ICU, in the intensive care unit. The product was still in development, and we actually participated in having customers provide feedback that ultimately improved the product prior to it being finalized and launched. And that's kind of the extreme end of the collaboration and working closely together with a manufacturing partner that I love to talk about.
Perfect. Sorry, I don't know if the echo is on me, but I'll just quickly pass it to Alana on this one, then we'll move on to the last question.
I had something similar to Vince, Arch and Mark, sorry, in that we had a hub, however, it was in Colombia, and then they rolled it out to Peru, Argentina, and Chile for us. So it was a really easy way of breaking into Latin America and kind of circumventing a lot of their registrations and things like that. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but at the time it worked out perfectly for us. Another call out that I've done in the past that has worked out brilliantly is, as a manufacturer, when a customer came to us and said that they were looking to expand their bespoke product portfolio, and we basically designed a brand new product for them, which up until that point they've been selling the original prototype within the UK market, but with the changes in design, that we offered them, they were able to roll it out across Europe and then eventually rest of the world. So I think thinking back, it was the single biggest growth jump within the history of the company, but also it really solidified the relationship that we had with the customer. Plus, it opened us up to designing and collabing with a lot of other customers also, because they weren't aware that we could offer this. Fair enough, we weren't aware we could offer this until we went ahead and did it and saw that it would be a viable product for us, but it opened up so many new project routes for us. So I think from that, I would say maybe don't be short-sighted if a distributor does come to you with an idea, because eventually it could open up in a lot of new channels or territories for you as well, even if it is 2 or 3 years down the line.
Great. So let's just keep an eye on time here. I'm going to bring up the last question, and I'm going to put our panelists in a bit of a spot here because I'm going to ask them basically to speak for the last 9 panelists on these sessions. So we did a 3-part series on collaboration between manufacturers and distributors. So for us, sort of wrapping up that 3-part series, how important is it from your perspective that manufacturers and distributors commit to exploring new and better methods to achieve stronger partnerships in the medtech space? So why don't we start with Vince, and then maybe Alana, Mark, you can chime in as well. Maybe we'll get to some questions.
Yeah, well, obviously, it's very important. Especially in a market like Canada, which is a relatively small market, right? 37 million people. Much of our innovation and new products and improvements in patient outcomes comes from products that are imported. We unfortunately have precious little domestic manufacturing. We're one of very few that have domestic manufacturing. So to me, the only way that we can continue to kind of grow in the medtech space and deliver value to our clinician partners and patients is to continue to develop these relationships. And the stronger those relationships, I think that the better outcomes you're going to get ultimately for the population, right? And we really rely on that type of innovation for the Canadian population.
Yeah, I would have to agree in that. I think the kind of landscape of medtech, it's ever evolving. We've particularly noticed that over the last sort of 3 years, especially. But I think this just means that it's imperative that we identify and maintain really strong partnerships within the global market. And I think the most importantly for me between manufacturer and customer is that everybody should have a voice. It shouldn't just be one person, the manufacturer dictating to the distributor or vice versa. I think that everybody should be considered, every point of view should be considered, and if you can keep up a kind of consistent, doesn't have to be constant, but if it's consistent flow of communication, you will maintain excellent partnerships globally, and I do think that it is something that everybody should take on board.
Mark, final thoughts? Yeah,
well, there's a responsibility. I think for me, really just developing what Alana said there, it's a changing world. Some countries are exiting COVID, have already done so. Some are partway through that. Elective cases are in some countries booming again. We're catching up in 2 or 3 years with the patients that are backed up in the system. So there's a sudden rush for need for product. Other countries not quite there yet, but getting there. And in a year's time that will happen. But again, forecasting is key. I think also as we all read the news and some of the terrible things we hear on the news, we're in a delicate geopolitical time too. And we have to remember that we're all part of a global village in that sense, and we've got to react to it when needed. And having that relationship with a distributor within certain countries is going to be critically important, because they're going to be helping us react to these situations too. So from both a manufacturer point of view and a global point of view, this couldn't be more important.
Great. So Angela, I believe we have a second poll question. We can bring that up while I'm. Oh, there we go. That was quick. So partner relationship rating. What percentage of your partners do you feel you need to improve the relationship and/or replace the partner? This is obviously anonymous. We're just curious about. You think about your overall total quantity of partners. What percent do you think need fixing? Put it in simpler terms. So go ahead and answer that, and we'll see what the results were. And while we're doing that, just encourage everyone to put questions into the Q&A panel, and we'll get to those here in just a minute, and then we'll wrap up. And I'll make sure I also communicate the contact information for everyone here in the panel. So interesting. So 20% represents 61% of voters said 20%. But there's a lot. Like if you look at 20, 40, 60 together and add that up, that's a lot of broken partnerships. So hopefully you found some of the information through this series and helping to fix those relationships and put the right KPIs in place and sales targets and everything else really helpful. So I've got some questions here that have come in. And again, encourage you to add more as we go here. We'll try to answer a few. If we don't get through them all, which we won't, we never do, we will send a follow-up though in the email afterwards that will have some answers just to the unanswered questions. So this is an interesting one that I haven't heard before, and I'd love your thoughts on it. And it's, do you encourage partners to collaborate between each other, for example, to share lessons learned? So I'm assuming the context on this is, let's say as a manufacturer, do you encourage your distributors to talk to each other about how they're having success in their markets with your products, and perhaps on the other side of the coin as well? So who wants to tackle this one?
I'll go with this one.
Go ahead.
We're going. In the past, we have, in companies I've worked in, we have done distributor meetings. So kind of like a commercial meeting that you would have with your team, but for global distributors. And they've always been excellent with countries that are kind of aligned in their route to markets process, e.g. in Europe. We find that they can share a lot of information and best practice with each other. And in countries like maybe the South America, for example, they like to know who has what product because they work a lot off reference sites. And if somebody in Argentina had a particular product, then Colombia want the same product. So I've always encouraged a kind of open partnership between any distributors because A, we have nothing to hide as a supplier. We approach it all in blanket terms, the way we treat our distributors. So there's nothing to hide there. But also it's great for them to be able to discuss how you sell in this product, what's working for you, what's not. And also for us to maybe learn from that as well. So yeah, I think a sharing forum is excellent and really best practice for companies if they can do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just building on what Alana said, we've had some long-term relationships with manufacturers where they would have an annual distributor meeting, and we'd send a representative or two to that meeting, and there'd be a ton of sharing of information and success stories between the various countries that are being represented. So to me, there's nothing to lose really by sharing what works really well with your partners, distributors in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, I was going to say exactly the same, and it's also a great opportunity for networking. And I say this with my manufacturer's hat on, is that if you get to meet some of the distributors guys, some of their sales teams who are really, really good, it saves a lot on recruitment costs later on.
Excellent. I'm going to have to pause the questions there. We're just about out of time, and I want to make sure I both thank the panelists, but also share their contact details in case you'd like to reach out to them. As I mentioned earlier, any other questions we didn't get to, which there are some, we will we'll send in a follow-up to this. So I want to thank Vince, Mark, and Alana. Really appreciate your time and insights into these challenges. I know there's a lot of interest in this series and today's webinar, so really appreciate you doing that. Vince, Mark, and Alana's contact information is up on the screen now. That'll also come out in the follow-up afterwards. As I mentioned earlier in today's presentation, a lot of companies are actually connecting as a result of these webinars. So certainly feel free to reach out if you think you've got an opportunity to discuss. I know Vince, Mark, and Alana are all looking for more partners in their parts of the world and parts of the world all over the place. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it. I am going to just transition. I'll allow the panelists to drop off because they've all seen the platform, in many cases use the platform. I am going to spend about 10 minutes just doing a quick demo of the platform. And I do, if anyone else is dropping off participant-wise, please thank you very much for joining. We're going to have a whole series of additional webinars coming out shortly that we'll keep in touch on. And thanks again to the panelists.
you.